Back in the 80s, 70s and the 90s, when these were in their prime, what they essentially were was a dedicated computer that did one thing, and that was run a particular game. And you could go to a particular venue, insert a coin and play the game. In this case I have Street Fighter in the corner here. Yeah. Well, the arcade cabinet has several electrical components inside of it. Biggest one and most noticeable one is the screen that powers it. It is just a stock standard computer monitor that would find at any old school or any old office. So it's nice and readily available. The computer that actually powers the screen is a small, low-powered Raspberry Pi. Very cheap, but just powerful enough to do the job, which is really what you need. There's no point putting a high-powered computer into something that's only going to do small, mediocre tasks. Well, to get the buttons to work, I created a small circuit board. It's about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters squared. It's basically just a pair of little integrated circuits, IC chips, and they allow you to program a circuit board from a computer. So one of the advantages of the Raspberry Pi and why we did it this way was that it has GPIO pins, general purpose input-output pins. And what that allows you to do is to connect the circuit board up to it, and if you know how to program it, and if you know how to make the circuit board properly, you can get information from the circuit board and in other situations send information to the circuit board. So in this situation we're just getting information from the circuit board. We've just got a series of buttons hooked up to close a circuit whenever they're pressed, which is a very simple process, essentially like just rubbing two wires together, very simple. And when that is detected by the circuit, a signal is sent to the computer. The computer then gets that signal and goes, aha, and presses a key, simulates pressing a key on a keyboard, and then the rest of the computer goes, oh, that key has been pressed, do this in the game. So, like that, it sounds fairly simple, but it was quite difficult. Well, if we start from the beginning, we used the operating system Raspbian, which is a variant of Debian, designed for the Raspberry Pi. Debian is Linux for the layman. From there up, we just used the basic terminal, didn't bother with a desktop or a window manager because that was just unnecessary overhead. To run the games, we used a program called MAME, Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator. All MAME does is it takes a file that represents the game that you want to run, say Street Fighter or Pac-Man or Frogger, and then runs that file. That's a bit simplified, but essentially that's what it does. To get the joysticks and buttons working, as I said, we used a bit of software to interpret the signals that are being sent by the circuit board. That bit of software is called Pi-Keyed, Raspberry Pi, Key Daemon. Daemon is the name for a program that runs in the background. So all that software works together to get this to work. To actually design the cabinet and actually get it working, we used a little bit of Blender and Google SketchUp just to get the initial shape of the arcade cabinet, the design of the exterior. To get the software that we wanted, for instance Pi-Keyed and MAME, we had to use a bunch of programs in the process. Nano, which is a text editor inside of the terminal. We had to use Git, which is a bit of software that allows you to download the source code for other programs and then compile them, which means that it's guaranteed to work and you always get the newest version. Yeah, we used a fair bit of software, almost too much to name, but we ended up getting there in the end. One bit of software that we've recently started using is called Fritzing. It's a German bit of software, and what it does is it allows you to design a circuit board or breadboard or schematics for electronic devices. So instead of sitting there with a bit of pen and paper trying to work out where resistors, chips, wires need to go on a breadboard, I could go into this program and then just with my mouse pick where these individual components would go. I could check to make sure it would work, and if I was certain it would work, I could then go and buy those components and build it myself. Well, I designed the exterior through a couple of means. First thing I did was just rough sketches in a botany book, which is what we use in woodwork and workshop classes. Just drawing inspiration from some of the original arcade cabinets that I've seen at Intensity next to Village Cinema. Then when I had a rough idea of what it was going to be, I then used Google SketchUp and then Blender to just make a 3D model so I could just have a look at it a little better, just so I could visualize it. And when I was happy with the shape, so the top bit up here, you know, just the rough shape of everything, I then went on to exact sizing, like how wide does it need to be in order to have two players playing a game comfortably while still not being too wide, because the screen can only be so wide. And once I worked out all those measurements, I did a quick, well not quick, a detailed drawing in the botany book again and added all the measurements required. The majority of it is MDF, so that's medium density fiberboard. It's a very, very cheap wood-based material. Purely because I chose it purely because this is just cheap, quite sturdy, and you know, quite malleable. You can turn it into quite a lot of things. And the only reason why you wouldn't use MDF in something is because it's quite ugly looking material, but in this case it was going to be covered with comic books, so I wasn't too concerned about using MDF. Initially I was just going to spray paint it glossy black. As you can see here, it is spray painted black majorly, but I found out after a coat or two of paint that it didn't look quite right, and it was taking far too many coats of spray paint. I went through a can of spray paint in one lesson trying to cover the whole thing. It was just, it didn't really suit. So I was, funnily enough, at Outzone and just playing some games and need to go to the toilet, and I noticed that the cubicles they had comic booked the doors, so they'd just taken pages out of comic books, slapped on some glue and just put it on the door, on the sides, and just overlapped and overlapped and overlapped, and it looked really nice. It looked quite fantastic. So I thought, well, that would be a pretty cheap and easy and kind of awesome way of making it look good. So went down to the tip shop and got a bag of comic books for about $5 or so, and yeah, I just scrapbooked it basically. Well, definitely want to start just by doing some rough sketches in a book of some description, just an art book or whatever, and just get a look down. As for the electronics, I'd recommend the Raspberry Pi website. If you just Google Raspberry Pi, P-I, it brings it up, and they've got all the electronics and the computing stuff side of it. And really just do a lot of Googling and a lot of research. The buttons and joysticks, there are a lot of businesses around the world that specialise in those joysticks and buttons. You'd be surprised how much of a market there are for them. So yeah, just really the internet is your friend in this case.